Yeah.
Okay. Webinar is open. Let's see. What did I do? 22 participants. Just wait a minute or two. Just give it a few minutes. Okay, Anne, I think we're at 9:01. So I'm going to give it a little bit of a start. Um, so I would just like to advise everyone that this webinar is currently being recorded, and we'll make it available to all attendees within the next week. I'd like to also do an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to begin by paying my respects to the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet, and pay my respects to the elders, past and present. I also extend this respect to the Maori, Pacifica, Aboriginal and Torres Straits people here today. Tia koutou, tia koutou, tia koutou, katoa. My name is Kim Ennis, and I'm the South Island Infrastructure Procurement Manager for the Ministry of Education in New Zealand, as well as the chair, excuse me, about the background noise, if you can hear it, the chair for the Christchurch CIPS committee. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. We've had a great response to this webinar, and thank you very much everyone for attending. We really appreciate the numbers that have come through for registration. A little bit about CIPS, for those of you that maybe don't know, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, or CIPS, is your global professional body for procurement and supply professionals, dedicated to promote best practice, continuous improvement in professional standards, and raise awareness of the contribution that procurement and supply chain make to an organization. Sorry, sorry guys, I've just got a bit of a noise here. We're joined by Anne Columbus. Anne is an EY associate partner currently leading the change management program for a large ERP transformation change, where she has a particular focus on supporting the detailed change analysis and impact to the procurement function, as well as the organisational procurement capability. Prior to her current role, Anne worked at Christchurch City Council, where she led a procurement program focused on cost efficiencies across process, people, procurement, contract management to drive better cost outcomes for Christchurch. During this time, Anne also had the procurement function as part of her ELT portfolio. Anne will today talk about managing procurement function change in the context of transformational change, impacting people, process, data, technology, including insights and observations that will help you consider what and how to manage change in your organization's procurement and what the capability is. We will follow up the discussion with a Q&A towards the end. Before we get started, Zoom housekeeping. All attendees must mute the mics during the presentation. However, there is a chat box if you want to write a comment, and we can answer those questions either during the event or after. If you have any specific questions, please enter them into the Q&A box and we'll attend to them. So I'm just going to hand over to Anne. I'm terribly sorry about the noise in the background here. Anne, you're on mute.
Kia ora, Kim, and tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa to everybody. Ko Anne Columbus ahau, tōku ingoa, ko o tautahi ahau. So I'm Anne Columbus and I'm coming to you from Christchurch, New Zealand this morning, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. Just Kim, can you just let me know that you can see my slides? So I can...
Yes, we can see your slides and hear you well. Oh, where your slides have disappeared, Anne.
Okay, I'll just... How's that? Are they there? Back?
Nope.
All right, done.
There you
okay.
Go, back. Good.
Right, thank you. Now that we've got the technology sorted, we can get started. So I am obviously coming to you here today from the perspective of having been a general manager sitting over a procurement function in a previous role, and currently sitting in a role in a large ERP transformation, as Kim has mentioned to you. But what I really wanted to talk to you today was about actually what does it really take to transform our organisational procurement capability. And this is really from the perspective of organisational transformation, where you've got procurement as a key enabler, and I plan on talking through sort of 7 key topics of my insights or observations to get you really thinking about what this really looks like for a procurement function to undergo transformation. Many of these key topics are actually applicable in the context of just a functional transformation, but still very relevant for you to be thinking about. And then also wanting to think about how you set up any procurement transformation for greater change success by understanding the effort and the key elements that support any change outcome. I know for lots of you, taking on a procurement transformation is often a new endeavour for many leaders and their teams, and it's helpful to really have that sense of what it will take, because ultimately you want change success. I really liked this quote from one of my colleagues in EY. It's the don't underestimate both the effort, because we do talk a lot about the value of transforming in our procurement capability and our procurement function, but we actually often underestimate the effort of what it actually takes to do that. So in the context of what I wanted to talk to you about today and share in terms of my insights, it was very much about that. Oops, going too fast. Right, here we go. So putting transformation in context. So we all know that procurement capability is a real growth capability. I look at it in organisations, it's really coming into its own. It's a bit like risk management, very front and centre. And there's certainly increasing interest in driving better performance and efficiencies for organisational gain through the procurement activities. It does actually require a whole of organisational approach and I'll talk a little bit more about that soon, but it becomes a challenging position for the procurement function because you're not only the implementer, you then become the holder or the policer of the capability moving forward. So as we know, when we work in back office functions, it's always a challenge getting the service delivery or the product makers, whatever kind of organisation you're in, actually accepting that you've got a dual role to play. Actually, one, to make sure that procurement is done well for the organisation and capability is strong, but also that people actually follow what's required. And it's often quite challenging because people don't necessarily see the broader implications of why good procurement practice is really important. Today I'm talking about a sizable transformation, and any transformation in my view involves the elements of people, process, data, and data/information, whichever terminology you want to use, and technology. And technology is usually the enabler. And technology is often the one that's talked about the most often, but actually the people, process, and data information piece is actually as important as the actual system itself, because it's the people that use it, it's the process that's set up through that technology, but not just in that system, off that system too. So all the activities that you would undertake around using a system to help you do your procurement. And then, of course, what flows through that technology in terms of data or information generating insight. So I'm definitely talking today about procurement activities in that context of a broader program. We know that the common catalysts for all of this is generally an organisational investment decision. It might be to modernise technology platforms, as I said, drive efficiency into existing processes and systems. Sometimes it might not even necessarily be front and centre. Certainly from a finance perspective, you start drawing in the other activities that you're doing in an organisation like procurement. And then we've also got the scenarios around greenfield, which is totally new system change into something different that your organisation's never used before, or brownfield scenarios where you are actually in a scenario you're upgrading your existing system, taking advantage of things like cloud-based technology, and you're looking to actually leverage what you've got in your existing environment. The challenges of all of this is you just don't know what you don't know, and I think we've all heard and seen many examples of the time and cost blowout that it takes to transform. But I think we just have to be really clear on the fact that there's often underestimation of the time and cost that it does take to do a transformation, whether at functional or organisational level. Often it's driven by the fact that the complexity of the organisation or what's happening in their organisation is far greater than was actually initially understood when, organisations bring in partners, technology partners, or business implementation partners, and then the actual effort that's required by the business to do that. And I'll talk a little bit more on that shortly. You'll see down there on the bottom, for those of you who are not so familiar with how big transformations go, or even any transformation, but this is at the moment I'm on an SAP transformation. Typically, you'll see this with any other kind of activity for any other kinds of implementations from a tech perspective, is you'll go into that initial discover phase where you're actually sort of looking at a high level, what's the technology that's on offer capable of doing against what you actually had initially put in terms of your requirements, and you discover and then prepare to get yourselves into what is called the explore phase, which is a much more detailed design phase where you spend a lot of time in workshops with your key SMEs, and representatives from the technology company. Change should be in there, and process business analysts should be in the room there too, working through actually the detailed design. Then you step into a realise phase, which is where the design actually gets built and then tested, and then you deploy, which is through activities like training and cutover, and then you step into run, where you actually cut over and you're going into the day one scenario. So it's quite a big piece of work that you're taking on in terms of effort. I believe that we have a tendency when we go into these spaces, particularly where there's technical elements involved, to actually think from the technical requirements first. So in my head, that's function before form. But I actually think you need to be thinking about the organisational procurement capability first. So form before function. So that's asking really and making sure that you're really clear in your own organisation around how are your procurement activities currently being performed across the organisation. I can think of some examples where an organisation that I was in where we started looking at actually how those activities, some of those very simple ones, purchase to pay, and came up with 23 different ways that the organisation was actually 23 different processes that were occurring across the organisation just to do that piece. So actually having a really good understanding of your current state, understanding what needs to be different in the future. And if you look at that circle there, you've really got to be looking at the whole of capability view. So right from strategy and governance, what's required in that space, down through the organisational and business model, resource skills and capabilities. You'll see performance management and reporting there, which is often sometimes a last minute thing to think about. Then you've got through the middle all the kind of very tactical or strategic relationships with the transactional kind of work that you would do in procurement, and then managing it through its entire life cycle with the systems and technologies that you have available. So really understanding actually what needs to be different and what you have now and what needs to be different in the future is quite critical to actually starting out on a successful change journey through transformation. The other piece to that is what is the current state of the organisational performance across this capability. So there are lots of tools that you can use around capability maturity assessment. There's lots of tools around for organisational model options from, are you wanting to get into an organisation? Does your organisation desire a low and decentralised level of procurement control versus a high and centralised level of procurement control? So they're all very important questions around thinking about what it is that you want to get out of your transformation. Obviously, what needs to be built in the future when you get that view can actually then help what's your roadmap, because I also see a lot of the time that you can target what you need over time, but what we can often see, and it drives some of the complexity, is wanting to get everything in one go. So it's actually making some really conscious choices around the fact that not every not everything that you want to put in needs to go in all at once, and you can spread it out simply because the effort and the complexity can be quite overwhelming. So obviously these activities and these thinking is supported and should be supported by your procurement strategy, which needs to take that really broad capability view. So I mentioned there internally and externally, because your procurement strategy might actually consider some opportunity for e-procurement too as well. And you really need to be thinking about what that will mean in terms of how you will target and manage your suppliers and vendors in the future. And I'll talk more about that later on as well. And then obviously your procurement policy, which obviously provides that guidance around the boundaries for how procurement activities will occur. But it's not just procurement policy, it's those other really strong relationships with things like DFA, segregation of duties, and credit card policies that are also really important. The next sort of topic that I want to talk about is then actually thinking about how important process is. So you've got a great understanding of what your desired capabilities are for the future, and then you need the best practice processes to really help cement that, because actually it's the processes that drive just about everything when you come into transformation. That's what's defined very early on through your detailed design. It touches on just about every part of a transformation program and the activities that are following. So when you think about your design and your build, you're talking actually about the processes. How's this actually going to work for people? How's this going to work in terms of what will be on system or off system? How's this going to work in terms of automation versus actually there's going to be some effort required to move between systems, particularly around those integration conversations. Change impact analysis actually really relies on process. So having a very good view on actually what your process structure is, using some business process methodology against standard best practice is actually really ideal in terms of helping define out what it is that you need. People don't actually necessarily realise too, though, that process actually also is a key, business process maps and things are actually also key contributors or documents that actually support the understanding of training needs analysis or role-based access. And obviously process maps also are a very important part of actually determining what testing you will undertake through the system as you move forward. And it's not just the transactional processes that we're talking about here, it's actually the whole end-to-end views too, which you're really wanting to understand how will procurement capability or activities flow through the organisation across the various platforms through and into your main ERP. And then, of course, process also informs the data and information needs that you'll obtain actually as you step through various activities. And as I mentioned earlier too, process also very much talks to the on and off system work activities, hence why having that end-to-end view is quite important. And what most people miss is actually process maps, whilst they at times can be often not visually pleasing to read, they actually talk through actually what steps might be needed to be taken in an Excel spreadsheet before you actually do something in a system, or actually that an actual physical activity needs to occur. Then we move into transformation, change and readiness. And my observation actually in transformation journeys is that the shared accountability factor is not actually well known. Now, there tends to be an over-reliance actually on the project or program efforts to actually do the change and readiness piece. But actually there's a huge, it's a 50-50 relationship between what the project is capable of supporting and delivering and actually what the business side needs to do. So the procurement function would need to do in terms of change leadership and business readiness. And, you know, it can be, business readiness can cover a whole lot of activities, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail shortly, but certainly things like business readiness around getting kind of master data in place for managing suppliers or vendors is actually a really important part. It feeds the data loads. It actually takes a lot of time and effort. It requires validation. It requires cleansing. And a lot of that effort just simply can't be done on the project side and relies on the business to be undertaking that activity. And then the change leadership piece too is very much around informed by your procurement strategy and all your policies, because the organisation should have a good sense of that. But actually the messaging out to the organisation around how things will be in the future, how things need to be in the future. For example, no purchase order, no pay, if that's something that's actually a really key driver around what you're trying to get out of your capability. That really needs to come from within the business side, complemented by what comes out of the project, to really actually build ownership on the business side that for change and readiness. So I guess my key takeaway in that space really is around the fact that the significant effort is required from the business or the procurement team and those who are supporting around it to be ready for day one. I think the other real challenge in this change and readiness piece around this shared accountability piece is procurement function often has a broader remit than some of potentially the other functions to facilitate. So you've got your procurement team activities, so how you're going to manage your actual team activities in terms of that what you will need to undertake on the system or within the system around the processes and everything. But actually there's that broader mandate around actually supporting the organisational procurement capability as well. So, you know, Centre for Excellence models are really common now. It's really, in my head, getting the little P, the procurement team ready for the big P procurement capability of the organisation, and building and cementing that. And that actually does take quite a lot of effort. It takes a lot of visioning. It takes a lot of focus and leadership from whoever is sitting on your project side, but also sitting within your procurement team. And what I see in this space is the challenges around things like sustained resourcing across the project or program tenure. And that's the resourcing that's required through champions networks. That's the support of the leadership from the procurement team to actually undertake all the effort that's required to actually get ready for a go live. And amongst that, the resourcing that comes from your BAU teams, and it will be champions to sort out data, it'll be champions to do testing, it'll be champions to actually be trainers if that's your training model. It'll be champions to actually communicate into the keeping up abreast of what's going on in the project and communicating in the change that's coming from detailed change impact assessments and things. But it's certainly a real challenge in a BAU team to procurement team to actually manage your ongoing function. And if you just think about the last couple of years and the challenges with supply chain and trying to manage that activity for the organisation, as well as taking on or you've got a big project or program occurring at the same time, it can get really challenging around being able to resource both activities. I think that's where, again, the challenge around defining what's really needed for day one, and it's great to have really ambitious ideas when you start, but actually being very prepared to what do we actually really need to do now for the team, for the organisation, and then look to what the future might be around further implementations or phases of technology enablement that will actually help you, rather than taking on too much simply because you've got a much broader remit. I think the other piece to that is also understanding that once the procurement, the project teams can do so much, but there's some activity that will need to continue on from the team post go live. So if you're putting in contract management and you're needing to contract management tools that you're needing to actually build on and share and work on very much with the organisation in the future to get them into the right place, how's the team, the procurement team, actually going to plan up and manage that program of work to really continue on with that continuous improvement and without necessarily having to step into any further implementations. The other call out there too is we often get very focused around day one, getting the system and the tools in place, and then we've got we have policy or strategic direction to actually get into a situation where there is no purchase order or no pay for suppliers. But then how are we going to continue to lift the organisational procurement performance through that piece with governance and reporting, and actually setting yourselves up because as a procurement function you typically report on those activities, but how do you set up to be able to report that actually our performance is this, and this is where we're moving to, and we've still got pockets where we need to actually support parts of the business to do what is required around raising purchase orders or needed. It is a challenging model because I think I'm not sure if anyone's actually really cracked the 100% purchase orders before pay, but you certainly you've got to have that ambition in mind, and you certainly need to be able to monitor for performance and report on that performance in that post go live scenario. So something to be really thinking about, because you don't want your investment through the transformation program to actually dwindle or wane post go live scenarios. Okay. I mentioned that there was a huge number of transformation activities or readiness activities that need to be completed in order to be procurement ready for any day one execution. And I've touched on these as we've moved through, but I think this is where the effort really comes in, and design actually really draws on the knowledge of your people, your team, those people that actually undertake procurement activities as a capability, part of the capability model in your organisation. But providing the resources and getting people involved in design, then the right people involved in data, and testing and training activities is actually really important, but most programs actually make the assumption that you're going to have a stabilized model of resources coming from your procurement team that work through sort of design. Those people who were involved in design then become involved in testing. Those people then become involved in the training. And this is particularly relevant when you are going into greenfields or a completely new application. The assumption is that actually your stable resources moving through these activities will then become your critical super users, your support and hypercare functions as you go in post go live. There'll be people that will really know and understand actually how the process has been designed to help their colleagues and the rest of the organisation actually implement what's been designed. So I think when we talk about readiness activities and when we talk about change management, people actually often overlook that a lot of this activity that occurs from the project or program that's actually being driven into the business is actually part of that change journey. It's part of that organisation getting ready and understanding that things need to be done differently. We're dealing with different data. We're actually going to be doing different transactions, or we're going to be doing undertaking steps in different ways. But those range of transformation activities are really critical to that broader piece around change success. I just wanted to touch quite quickly on managing risk in this whole space too. So I think there needs to also be appreciated that there's a significant focus required in any systems around getting DFA and segregation of duties right. And it's not just around the process, so of workflows and who's going to be approval, your delegated financial approvals against your policy, and have you actually got the right settings as you go into your system. It does actually drive a lot of complexity, particularly in new systems, but I would also caution that in existing systems, there might actually also need to be quite a fair bit of cleanup work to actually get that right. The DFAs may have shifted, or your organisation's actually looking for a stronger management in that place. So it is actually a lot of effort and focus required for that. And balanced against that is actually the fact that you're still wanting to try and keep it simplistic, because we know that approval processes, all that sort of thing around procurement and everything can actually often be viewed by the organisation as overly burdensome, and it doesn't help the cause of building a capability that's going to provide the organisation of that very strong view of how procurement, what procurement spend is, what's going on in the organisation. But it's getting that balance right, and that takes some serious thinking. It requires very strong alignment with your finance and internal audit functions, not to mention the conversations with the business, because the practicalities of how you set these activities up becomes the end user who actually is the one that's involved in that, and and the managers and things. And you really want to make sure that you're not overly burdening or creating an overly administrative environment for people to be working through. I think the other call out here too is that delegated financial authorities and segregation of duties actually also drives effort in unexpected places. So this whole piece around security and user access and getting that right, particularly where you're using role-based access for your people, is actually takes quite a lot of thinking, detailed thinking and planning to get right, as much as making sure that the system has a number of controls in place that actually manage quite a lot of the heavy lifting around segregation of duties, but the validation of that, what's been put in, is actually also needs to be really clearly managed as well. So I think it's quite important just to call out that as you embark on these programs of work, it's what you as I went back to it, it's what you don't know that's actually going to require the effort. My final slide is actually talking to managing suppliers and vendors, because in my observation, this could be quite easily a project within a project, especially if you're introducing something like e-procurement and the activity or effort that would be required to onboard suppliers into those kinds of environments. And I think it can be quite challenging at times to actually get suppliers on board in terms of the benefits of what it'll mean for their organisation and your organisation for doing that, knowing that at times actually there may end up being more of a burden on the vendor side. There is significant effort involved in managing suppliers and vendors, and if procurement's got the organisational ownership for managing all of those suppliers or vendors, or sometimes I've seen it sitting with finance. It's really important to understand who's maintaining or holding that consolidated view, and actually the effort that's going to be required around master data management, for particularly for systems like SAP, where such a data-rich tool that requires everything to be really accurate to be able to drive those real-time insights. And I think, really truly understanding across the organisation the functional management of various supplier groups. So getting an understanding that supplier segmentation, and then understanding who the key relationship holders are for those supplier segmentations is actually also a piece of work that will require effort. And we often overlook actually what is required in terms of the planning and timings, because comms with your suppliers and vendors are obviously really tightly coupled to cut over, not just if you're using them in the e-procurement environments, but very much because vendors and suppliers, typical examples would be needing, if they're wanting to get paid before you go live, and there's a ramp down and a ramp up activities that need to occur because of data blackouts or brownouts, then you really need to be communicating early with your vendors around those activities. There's also quite a lot of work too with vendors around actually, if you're going to jump into that automation space and actually do some heavy lifting across your really key suppliers, where you've got high transaction volume around the integration effort that's required on both sides for there. So I hope that's given you some insights and some opportunities and questions to ponder. I'll pause there and stop sharing my slides, and I think we're ready for questions and answers.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. That was great. I've got some questions for you. I just wanted to know, how have you dealt with very difficult stakeholders when they don't want to adopt change and transformation that procurement is pushing out?
Yeah, that's a great question, because, as I've said before, you're wanting to do the right thing as a procurement function by the organisation, but actually people are finding that it can be a burdensome administrative activity at the user face. So I think the real key to this, and it can be for lots of reasons why people are being difficult. One, the most common one I've seen is people don't actually understand what's been designed and why it's been designed in that way. And as soon as you start getting into the why, what's the bigger outcome here for the organisation around managing your procurement activities, around giving the organisation that really solid view of what your spend is, what activities are going on, how you're looking to source goods and services in a much more efficient and effective way for the organisation. That actually can help them with that change and transformation. Sometimes it's especially when you're in organisations where there is actually a low, I'm going to say compliance, but actually, people aren't required to raise purchase orders currently, or the system requires it, but people don't do it. Shifting people into that space, and getting them actually to set aside time in their day to know and understand that they're going to need to be managing workflows for approvals. They're going to need to be actually raising purchase orders, and this is why, is actually that's really important. So I tend to, when we do it, and we know that we've got stakeholders who are, or teams that are actually really resistant, it's actually bringing some key people in, having face-to-face conversations, and getting to the, what do you know about this? What don't you know? Why are you seeing this as a challenge, and how can we alleviate that? And that's really the best way, getting that face-to-face. Yeah. Oh, you're on mute, Kim.
Sorry, Anne. What are the biggest issues you've had to overcome with business transformation and change?
Yeah, facing one of those at the moment, actually. So like big programs, complex, things can go wrong. You've got this, as you're heading into your go live scenarios, you've typically got people really busy managing data and getting data right in for data loads into production and things. You've got people really busy doing final UAT rounds. And from a business transformation and change, we're also taking people on a learning journey before you get to training. So, and you really need to be getting people in the organisation actually leaning in to be able to talk to each other around what is going to be different between the cross-functional relationships that they have around procurement. You need to be making sure that your team is really clear on actually understanding what the changes are going to be in terms of how their everyday work goes through their inputs, throughputs and outputs of the work that the design is going to, process design is going to actually change. And what happens is, as you start going into those sort of 3 to 4 months pre-go live, you start getting quite the same resources are needing to undertake the same activities for testing, for data, for change activities, change leadership. And you're also trying to draw your business in to actually take on some of that leadership. And it can be really tricky navigating through. And what we've just found in this current program that I'm on, we're actually having to scale back some of the activities that we had planned for session drop-ins and system demos, because of the fact that we haven't actually on this occasion had the system ready in time for when we needed to actually implement these activities. There hadn't been enough testing done through in particular areas that was making it quite challenging, and the focus actually becomes very much on testing quality and data quality. So you can get into the situation where the business transformation and change activities can be challenged by the other quality outcomes that you're trying to drive from the program.
Thanks for that, Anne. Okay, so this is my last question before we go on to the audience questions. How does training help to with the change and transformation of a project?
Yeah, great question, Kim. And I have a view that organisations actually over rely on training in terms of the change. So training typically comes down to a transaction. Transaction type training in the context of a process, but not necessarily in the broader context of the end to end. What is the organisation trying to achieve through its various value chains? And hence why the learning journey, which sits training is a part of learning, the learning journey around getting people leaders forums going, so that people have leaders are having leaders are having a deep dive into actually what does a change mean in their teams, and then going and communicating that with their teams, then having the system demos so that people actually get the opportunity to sort of get a feel and look of the system, is also but also the context for how those transactions are going to occur in an end-to-end scenario. Then you're getting into the drop-in so that people can actually come and actually see a more broader cross-functional view of why where activities sit within the end-to-end. It might be service delivery or product delivery, whatever it is that you're doing in your organisation, is equally important as training. You still want everyone to be trained though, and should be aiming for really high training attendance, because um, most people, most end users, that's what they're most interested about. And most people just sort of sit waiting for training to turn up, and I'll get training and then it'll be fine and I'll go into my day one, and it'll be okay. The other really key part about training is training actually doesn't drive competence. Training is knowledge, and training gives you that view on how you will go about a transaction, and you can go back and refer to that. But actually, the competence around doing that activity comes from your day one. It's where you practice and you continue to practice, and then you problem solve, because it might not have happened as you anticipated. So it is a really important element to change, but it's not the be all end all. There are a whole lot of other activities that really support change. And I also talked earlier too about the fact that you're building that SME knowledge across the various activities in the program is also a really critical part of change adoption, because you're building your super users in your business to really help the organisation side actually adopt.
Okay. So, Anne, we've got quite a few questions here. I'm just going to start with the Q&A questions first. So the first one is, some organizations I've worked for have great capability on the upstream procurement activities, mainly sourcing, but not so good capability on the downstream procurement activities, commercial management. Do you find this do you find this as a challenge in your transformation projects, and how do you address this?
Great question there. I think what I've seen, and the challenge is, and what I've seen, I saw it a lot when I was actually in working at Christchurch City Council too, is you've got um, you've got people in the organisation who leaders who are taking on a whole lot of activities, and commercial management is just one of them. So how you set up that capability as a organisation, and what you expect from your people who are the front face, the relationships of those commercial arrangements, is not necessarily it's not necessarily technology driven, because it's actually the way people are behaving, and it makes it really challenging to actually then drive commercial management in that space. I think this is a good question, where you need to be thinking about, when you're going through your transformation journey, you actually work out when is the right time to really drive that capability in amongst actually what you're trying to achieve out of a technology implementation. And is it an activity once you've started to get your building blocks in place? Is it an activity that comes later, and it's a real focused activity around building that commercial management amongst um, your broader organisation?
Okay, the next one. Often business cases to procure and implement procurement software are not prioritized against other more needed operational business outcomes. In your view, what are the key success factors to obtaining internal approval for procurement software solution business case?
I've been there too. The I think the best sell, and I know sitting up in the exec leadership roles, the best sell is actually showing the cost benefit. So can you actually bring in some software that's actually going to drive value in terms of you know efficiency or effectiveness gains for the organisation? And it is quite challenging, and it's also the fact that when you procure and implement procurement software, you're not often, I find, there's real focus on the technology, but not actually a really strong focus on the people, process, and data elements, and actually being able to really talk to the actual benefits that you'll gain, particularly if you can identify really strong cost benefits, is actually one of those keys. The other thing that I've seen work very well is hanging the procurement piece off the finance, any finance transformations too. So it's done in parallel, because of course you kind of can't do one without the other.
Thanks, Anne. Okay, so I've got another question. Often the state of readiness between all parties involved is never in sync. For a huge business transformation, what would you suggest is a good project team size and mix?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm just trying to make sense of it actually. So, yes, I'm involved. I never in sync. Yep, that's true. I mean, obviously, the readiness of the project team and the business often um, you, project teams, particularly as they head into delivery dates, seem to be like just this big freight train that's very much measured on the project plan and the timelines and meeting key milestones and everything. And the business side is actually trying to still do what you're actually there in business to do, as well as keep up. So it is really, really challenging. Um, I think for a huge business transformation, what would you suggest is a good project team size? So if I'm thinking about um, the yeah, it's a bit hard to judge actually what a good project team size would be, and I'm not sure whether you're meaning the resources from procurement supporting the actual activity. On the current project that I'm on, we've got um, we've got a procurement business lead. We've so represents the business. We've got well, we had a number of procurement champions that have participated over that period of time that have come from the business. We've currently got two full-time procurement champions actually doing the testing and training and activity. I feel at times that can be a little bit light, but I'm not sure if I've answered your question. But what's more important though is how the rest of the procurement team get close to it and get involved and actually do help that business lead and all those champions do a lot of the heavy lifting. It's a really tricky role being the business lead for any function actually in a project, because you're basically the conduit between the function and the project, and you have to weave your magic through that to get it right, and you're not always going to get it right, and there's always going to be the team. You need your functional team behind you to really support actually how processes have been designed or what you're trying to achieve through your procurement strategy. I hope I've answered that.
Thanks, Anne. As best as you can. I think it depends on the size of the
Yeah,
project.
project. Yeah,
You know, and
yeah,
how invested the company really is as to the money they prepared to
yeah,
spend on those people that are full time on the project,
that's
and
right.
obviously time
Oh,
out of BAU as well.
that's right. So, like, I mean, I know like the project I'm on is tens of millions of dollars, and at its peak, we've got about 180 on the project team, and it's
Yeah,
a mixture of resources that have been brought in on the tech side, um, the um, the business side, and uh, um, yeah,
yeah, for
yeah,
full ERP
contractors are coming in
implementation.
for full
Yeah.
ERP implementation. So yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
let's kick on here. From your perspective, up to what level does procurement manage or is responsible when it comes to contracts with vendors? As most of the organizations I work for, internal stakeholders are expecting the procurement to take lead. I don't know if it really a question around implementation and systems per se, um, but I can say from my experience, I've worked for companies where a lot of the contracting is done operationally, as opposed to government entities where all of the contracting is done by the procurement team. Anne, have you got any take on that?
Yeah, like it's an operating model question around how does the organisation want to manage it, and where do those responsibilities lie between what the procurement team does and then what does the actual internal stakeholders for the organisation need to do in terms of that lead. I certainly saw um, mixed models in the organisation, Christchurch City Council, where I worked, where you had some internal stakeholders who were very good and very comfortable in that space to take that lead around managing the contract with the vendor. But uh, sometimes it actually requires some hand holding for leaders as well, actually to get them into that space too. But yeah.
Okay, what is the optimal um, statistically timing for company business transformation, small, medium, or large organization? Also, I suppose, depends on what they're implementing and the size of the implementation.
Oh, I'm with you on that one. That's the million-dollar question. So,
Yeah,
depends on what you
always.
are actually, yeah, what you're wanting to achieve. And um, the challenge with that is that you'll generally go out, you'll do your requirements around what you need as an organisation, um, and then you'll go to your vendors, and your vendors will come back and sort of give an indicative view. But it's not till you start getting into the first the discovery and or detailed design that you actually truly get a true sense of the actual timing it'll take to implement.
Yeah,
And that's the challenge. I think that's always the
yeah.
challenge.
I
Yeah,
think also because some companies underestimate the
yeah,
workload when they start. And when they start process mapping, they start realizing that this is far bigger. So sometimes the timing that they originally estimated is way underscoped, because the scope of the project evolves as you go through it. Okay, let's pop onto the next one. We are seeing many customer facing systems driving to digitization. Um, Driving bespoke requirements into procurement systems and processes. Do you have any experience or thoughts on how we may manage this demand without creating complexity within procurement? So I think it's talking about alternate systems pushing into the procurement system.
yeah. Actually, I don't have any direct experience of it. I was reading a really interesting paper yesterday on exactly this, and I think it's becoming increasingly more prevalent, not just in procurement, but in lots of activities where you're providing a service or a product. Um, and I think, yeah, look, I can't give any sort of thoughts on how to manage that demand because I'm not in that space, but I could certainly find out from some of my colleagues if that's a really key question that you'd like some advice or guidance on.
Yeah, the person has just asked if it's possible for you to share that article that you refer to, that you read. I'm not too sure if it's a um, EY document you can't share or something that you could
Yeah,
share
no,
potentially.
I can. Yeah,
Yeah,
I can share.
yeah.
It was a nice little example, so I'll send it through to you, Kim.
Okay,
Yeah.
then, or maybe to John at CIPS, and then he has the database of
Oh,
who's
yeah.
been at the meeting. And
Hmm.
then we had a question here around, thanks, Anne, for your presentation. You mentioned that automation and technology piece, and I was wondering if you would be able to share some examples that you've come across where blockchain technology is used, and is currently being implemented in procurement function. I don't think this is a hell of a lot of this around, Anne, from what I know.
No,
I don't know
no.
if you actually have any
Yeah.
background on that.
No,
No.
I haven't seen that yet. I know people are talking about it. I think probably particularly in New Zealand, what we're seeing is there's a lot of shifting into technology, or, cloud platforms that are going to enable blockchain technology in the future. But the organisations here are very much getting their foundations right to be able to do that work in the future. So yeah, I've heard more blockchain actually occurring in the shipping industry. So I understand it's quite prevalent in global shipping, but I haven't actually seen any close examples down here in kind of procurement activities in New Zealand.
Okay, I'm going to try and squeeze one or two. We've only got 4 minutes. So someone is saying here that they're busy focusing on improvement in capability and providing opportunities for professional growth, but often it feels as if they're spoon feeding the solution to the business. Um, how do you overcome the little red hen mentality and encourage the shared accountability?
Yeah, and
You kind of
that
covered
is
that a little bit earlier on, I think.
yeah. Yeah, I think I did. Look, it is really challenging, because actually, it's people putting their heads in the sand and not really wanting to take it on. I think you need a really clear mandate from your executive, and senior leaders in your organisation, around why this is important. I know that's not always easy, but certainly, if you're going back to, your organisational strategy documents, this is what we want out of our capability. This is why we need to do it. I think sometimes it actually also people need to see why it's beneficial to the organization. And sometimes when you're down at that, end user or that front facing, I've got to do all these procurement activities, it's not so obvious the greater benefit or the greater good to the organization. So making that really, visible is also really important. You tend to see the kind of the key reporting around procurement, or how the organization's operating in terms of capability or, activity is, not necessarily visible to the entire organisation. It tends to go very much upwards. So,
Yeah.
sometimes getting people to see that bigger picture. Yeah.
I think the other thing that has worked before on a past ERP project was to talk around why does procurement do the things that they do, and why are we making the changes that we're making. And this needs to
Yeah.
be quite personal conversations with the different departments across the company. It needs to be face to face discussions with people in a room where they can do Q&A to you, as to say, why are we changing this, why are we changing that, because then you start um, getting them to understand what you've built and why you've built it and the benefits of it. And then you start seeing a shift from that spoon fed to them being more interested.
Yeah.
Okay, I think
Yeah.
we're on 9:59, and so unfortunately, there's quite a few other messages here. Might be an idea for you and I to go through them and maybe give some answers to them later on. But I'd just like to
More than
say
happy
to
to.
everyone, um, thanks for joining us today, and just a real shout out to Anne, to say thank you so much for doing this for us. It's incredibly invaluable to hear your experience and your knowledge in this field. And I know I've worked with you before, so I know it's tried and trusted. And thanks very much to everyone. And hopefully, if you want to send more questions through, um, you can just reply maybe to the CIPS committee representative. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.